Good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to introduce Dr. Candyce Kroenke. She is going to be presenting on a very timely topic. I guess there's an echo here. I'm not really sure if that's the way it's supposed to be. As most of you probably know, Dr. Vivek Murthy, the U.S. Surgeon General, recently issued an advisory that stated that loneliness is a new public health epidemic here in the United States. The Surgeon General stated that loneliness and social isolation results in significant health consequences, which include a profound effect on mental health, as well as an increase in cardiovascular disease, as well as dementia. Therefore, he further stated that, quote, "We must prioritize building social connections the same way we have been prioritizing other critical public health issues such as obesity, smoking, and other substance use disorders." So today we're really fortunate to have Dr. Kroenke come and talk to us on this topic. She has been conducting research not only on lifestyle factors, but also on she's conducted seminal work on understanding the relationship between social networks, social support, and social isolation on outcomes of cancer, particularly among women who have breast cancer. She has also examined the role of social network in racial disparities in breast cancer treatment and survival. Dr. Kroenke, this is something that I found out last night, received her bachelor's in sociology here at the University of Minnesota, as well as a master's in public health and epidemiology at the School of Public Health here at the University of Minnesota. She received her doctorate at the Harvard School of Public Health, where she continued on as an instructor in the School of Medicine there. She subsequently was a scholar, Robert Wood Johnson Scholar, and had studied at the University of California, both at Berkeley and San Francisco. She then subsequently assumed her current position, which is she's a research scientist in the Division of Research at the Kaiser Permanente in Northern California. So without further delay, Dr. Kroenke, we're really delighted to have you, and we're very excited to hear your presentation.
Thank you.
Okay.
I think I left the speaker on. No, it should be there. It's just... All right. There you go.
Good morning, everybody. Oh, wow. This does have a little bit of an echo, but hopefully it won't show up in the Zoom talk. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share with you some of the work that I've been doing on social relationships and cancer outcomes. And one of the things that I specifically want to address is whether or not we should be considering social relationships and some of the concepts around it as a vital sign in cancer patients. And then finally, what can we do to help socially isolated patients? So the way I would like to start is to present a little bit of a chronological timeline, because that'll give a better sense of some of the work that I've been doing, along with some other initiatives that have been going on at KP, as well as more generally. So I'm going to start out describing some of the randomized controlled trials that were done early on in terms of trying to provide social support to breast cancer patients and improve on cancer outcomes. I'm also going to describe a little bit about the Institute of Medicine and now the National Academy of Medicine, some of the reports that have come out about the importance of social factors in health. KP has launched a variety of different initiatives related to social determinants of health in patients. And everything from, they launched the EHR in 2006, which helps to facilitate some of this work, trying out alternate approaches to vital signs. So I'm going to mention some work about exercise as a vital sign, as well as KPNC directive to collect social support information in cancer patients, KP Thrive Local, and then of course rolling out some additional data. This is also at the same time as some of the work that I've been doing to develop this area and think about the clinical ramifications of it, including K award and some R-level funding, and a project that I'm going to describe called EHRsupport, which sort of brings some of this home. So as a brief overview, I mentioned I'll present some context about the studies that kind of kicked all this off, talk about some of the population level work that I've been doing, and then describe implications for clinical care. So you may be well familiar with the idea of social determinants of health. And this is a figure that the Kaiser Family Foundation put together, describing some of the different social determinants of health. So I'm going to point in particular, my work has focused on the community and social context with emphases on social integration and social support. So at this point, I'd like to introduce a few different concepts because that'll help in terms of understanding what I'm talking about in this talk. So I do talk a lot about social networks. It's also known as structural social support. And I define this as the web of social relationships that surround an individual. I mean, essentially, we're talking about people's social ties and the frequency of contact with them. And then even drilling down more, we're essentially talking about people's family, friends, religious and community organizations, work, online, etc. A lot of my work does pertain mostly to the first four. Finally, another couple of constructs I talk about are the notions of social isolation as well as social integration. Social isolation being the lack of ties or the lack of contact with ties, and social integration being sort of the flip side of that, having lots of ties, connections with other people. Another construct that I'm going to talk a lot about is this notion of social support, also known as functional social support, which is defined as the perception and reality of the exchange of assistance through social relationships. There are a variety of social support models that have been developed for research. The one that I use is one that was developed by Sherburne and Stewart in 1992, and they had collected data in a variety of chronic disease patients, asking about the type of support they had received. And when they did factor analysis, the types of social support fell into 4 different categories. The first being tangible and instrumental support. This idea of like help with chores, the rides to the pharmacy, the sort of nuts and bolts of physical kind of care. Emotional and informational support, technically, they're a little bit different. Support that can help with emotions versus like education or information, but these factored together, and so I'll lump these together as well. There's affection, hugs and kisses, that kind of thing, and then there's something that they called positive interaction, or having someone with whom you can have fun, get your mind off of things for a while. So the randomized control trials. This finding, this survival graph was published by David Spiegel in the Lancet Journal in 1989. And this was a study that they had done to provide an emotional support intervention to metastatic breast cancer patients. And when they started, it was really designed to improve quality of life outcomes. But when they got to the, by the end, they noted that people who were in the intervention condition had 2-fold higher, longer survival than those who were a part of the educational control group. Now, I will note that this study was not designed to look at survival outcomes. And so this ancillary finding was a surprise and exciting. And of course, this particular study has been cited many times over 3,000 citations. But because it was not designed to look at survival, it really did need replication, especially since by the end, the control group was down to like the attrition, it was down to 11 patients. And so this really needed to be tested again. And so Pam Goodwin came along with her team and did try to replicate this study, and then published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2001 the results of their trial. So they designed it to match the original Spiegel study. And they even hired David Spiegel as a consultant to make sure that they were doing everything the same. And when they got down to the end of the study, which was now powered for survival, they found that there was no difference in terms of survival outcomes in the intervention versus the control condition. So a lot of public health tends to gear itself towards trying active intervention. And so there were a lot of early trials, randomized controlled trials, trying to see whether or not emotional support interventions might move the needle on survival. And this is sort of a meta-analysis done by Smedslin and Ringdahl of some of those early trials. And while there's a suggestion of some potential benefit, especially in certain studies, including the original Spiegel study, overall, they did not find a significant effect of emotional social support interventions and breast cancer survival in metastatic patients. So, lest you think that this is only in breast cancer survival, this is a this is an intervention study that was done to provide social support in cardiovascular disease patients, and they too. This was published by Lisa Bergman in JAMA in 2003. They found overall that there was no effect of social support intervention, either overall among people with low social support in men, women, or by race. Randomized control trials are generally considered to be the gold standard, and they do provide really important information, but they're not perfect. So it's possible that social support may matter for quality of life, and there's lots of evidence to show that it does, but it may not matter for survival. It's possible that the metastatic patients, it just may be too late to intervene to try to improve survival. There's always the issue of small groups. You tried to power your study, but it's still pretty small. There's the issue of strangers in chemistry. When you get people into a room, are they going to gel? Are they going to be able to provide social support? Are they going to like each other? So that could be a potential concern. The other thing is that all of these interventions were designed around providing emotional support specifically. And as I've already indicated, there are a variety of types of social support. And so maybe there's other points of leverage that we can use to try to improve outcomes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the population-based work that I have been doing to look further at this question. So a lot of my work started out with this particular study. This was a paper that I published in the Journal of Clinical Oncology a while back, and I was looking at the social network index with breast cancer outcomes in the Nurses' Health Study. And what I found was that women who were socially isolated, and just to give you a sense of who these were, maybe they were married, but they had relatively few friends or weren't involved in community or religious groups. These women were 2 times more likely to die of their breast cancer than women who were socially integrated and had a lot more of these kinds of ties. When I looked at the different types of social ties that went into this index, I found that women with no or few close relatives, no close friends, and no living children had several-fold higher breast cancer mortality compared to those in the close relatives. It was compared against those with 10 or more close relatives. With friends, they were 4 times more likely to they were more likely to die of breast cancer compared to those who had 10 or more friends. And then those who had no living children were over 5 times more likely to die compared to those with 6 or more living children. Interestingly, in this study, religious and community participation was not related to the outcomes. And there are a variety of studies showing that marital status is a predictor of cancer survival. In this study, we found no association. But this study was done, it was in 2,800 patients, and we wanted to replicate this work. And so there was, I applied for and obtained funding to try to replicate this in a pooled cohort, the After Breast Cancer Pooling Project. And this was nearly 10,000 patients. What I found by using a parallel social network index was that women who were socially isolated did have significantly higher levels of recurrence, cancer-specific mortality, and overall mortality. I've also started to do some work in other kinds of cancer patients. So this was a study in colorectal cancer patients using data from the Women's Health Initiative. And I found that women with low levels of social support, that you can see in this sort of top line on the left graph, the arrow is pointing to it, women who had low levels of social support were more likely to die of their colorectal cancer, or more likely to die overall after diagnosis. And they were also more likely to die specifically of their colorectal cancer, and that tended to occur within 10 years of diagnosis. The other thing that I've sort of considered is not just necessarily the size and the extent of people's social networks, but the quality of their social networks. And this is data that I published from the Life After Cancer Epidemiology cohort, a cohort of over 2,200 patients. And when I cross the social network size with sort of quality of relationships, I found that people who had small social networks with high quality of relationships did not have an elevated risk of mortality. It was only those who had a small network with low levels of social support that had elevated mortality compared with the larger, compared with the people who had larger social networks. This is sort of a summary slide of a meta-analysis that Julie Holt-Lundstad did of all of the different types of ways in which social networks and social support have been related to mortality, and found overall that social relationships indeed influence survival, that the strongest associations are for more complex measures of social integration, and I'll note that the weakest associations were for the variable like living status, which actually tends to be frequently used in clinical care. So I'll make a special note of that. Some of this early work led me to sort of think about a conceptual model for how this might occur. And so the way I think about it is that people's social networks and their social ties, as well as the structural aspects of those social networks, influence breast cancer outcomes through a variety of social and psychosocial mechanisms. Social norms, the people around you influence your behaviors, through social resources, through social support, as I've already sort of indicated. And then, of course, there is the double-sided aspect of social relationships, which is the more relationships you have, there are social obligations, there can be caregiving burdens, social strain with certain relationships that can affect health as well. These in turn have downstream effects on a variety of behavioral and physiologic mechanisms, including treatment-related factors in diagnosed patients, lifestyle behaviors such as physical activity, smoking, diet, weight, and then also a variety of physiologic intermediates. These in turn influence outcomes such as recurrence, cardiovascular outcomes in cancer patients, as well as cancer-specific mortality. And then these associations are shaped by a variety of potential effect modifiers, including contextual factors, sociodemographic factors, as well as disease severity factors. So in some of the work that I've done, I've looked at some of these constructs with a variety of behaviors, And as you can see from data in the After Breast Cancer Pooling Project, that women who are socially isolated have lower levels of physical activity, higher levels of obesity. They're more likely to be current smokers. And they're also more likely to have high levels of alcohol intake. All of these factors have been related to breast cancer survival. Furthermore, social support, social isolation has been related to a variety of treatment outcomes. In this work that we published, we found that women who had low levels of social support had 30% higher likelihood of not initiating treatment. So this was in women who had hormone receptor positive cancer, and these are the women in whom they're prescribed adjuvant endocrine therapy. And so if they had low levels of social support, some of them just simply did not ever start that medication. And then among those who did initiate medication, they were more likely to discontinue that treatment within 5 years after the starting. And of those, I mean, the ones who still may have continued treatment, they continued at a lower level. So they had medication possession ratio less than 80%. And so we found significant associations for all of those different outcomes. We've also found that women with low levels of social support are more likely to have delays to surgery after a diagnosis. And this is early or preliminary work that our team has done in the Pathway study. I've also been interested in the impact of social relationships on quality of life, both because it's an important outcome in and of itself, but it's also related to survival. And we found that socially isolated women are more likely to have low levels of overall quality of life. And breaking that further down, we found specifically that this type of social support that I mentioned, called positive interaction, or having somebody with whom you can have fun, get your mind off of things for a while, was the one component that was specifically related to a variety of different outcomes, including lower levels of nausea, lower levels of pain, less need for bed rest, and higher levels of energy. Now, as I've mentioned, I've been interested in mechanisms, and that's been the reason for the conceptual model. I'll note that in some of the work that I've done, adjustment for lifestyle factors and treatment factors has not explained associations, starting with associations with quality of life. And then also when I've done work, I have also not found adjusting for those factors to explain associations of social isolation or social support and outcomes. And so that suggests that there are other mechanisms that may be important that help to explain the effects. So I have not done a lot of work in physiologic intermediates, but I've done some sort of initial work. And this was with a student, or it was not a student, it was a postdoc. And we started to look at associations with a couple of inflammatory biomarkers. And we found that both social network size was related to lower levels of C-reactive protein, which is a marker of inflammation. It was also related to lower levels of white blood cells. And regarding the second factor, social support was also related to lower levels of that. Conversely, social strain was related to higher levels of both. There's a lot of great research in this area, and we've only just touched the surface of that. But for right now, I'm going to summarize some of the work that I've done to date, which is that social support and social isolation predict cancer outcomes, including recurrence, cancer-specific and overall mortality. They predict health-related quality of life, including pain. They also predict a variety of behavioral and intermediates, and as well as physiologic intermediates. These are definitely questions that we're going to have to continue to think about, both in terms of the importance of thinking about the adverse effects of social isolation and loneliness outcomes, as well as thinking about the fact that a lot of this sort of translates into the fact that somebody is providing care for somebody, and that there are millions of unpaid caregivers, 3/4 of whom are women. So this is an ethical consideration that we have to give thought to. But right now I'd like to turn and talk a little bit about some of the clinical implications of this work. One of the questions I often get is, like, really interesting research. We kind of know and really interested in the fact that social relationships influence health outcomes, but like, what is it that you tell people to do now? Is it you go and tell them to get more friends? And that's, of course, like the intuitive and the easy sort of answer, but I'm really trying to shift thinking away from some of the individual level interventions, which could potentially be important, but thinking a little bit more about some of the system level possibilities for this work. So I'm just going to point to a few reports that were done by Institute of Medicine, National Academy of Medicine, that point to the fact that social needs are important, specifically in terms of clinical care, not just as a didactic or educational exercise. They published a report called Vital Signs, and provided a list of a variety of different factors that are important to consider in clinical care. And this includes, you can see at the bottom, community engagement, which includes social engagement as well as social support. I happen to be at an organization that has been increasingly interested, and other healthcare organizations too, in social determinants of health, just because they so strongly shape people's outcomes. And in that context, it's been relevant that they launched the electronic health record in Epic in 2006. Some of the early work, this was sort of mid 20-teens, this was some work that was done by Richard Grant and his team, considering whether or not the inclusion of exercise as a vital sign had any sort of clinical impact. And so they had altered the workflow of medical assistants. They meet the patients, and then they were taught to ask a couple of questions. Specifically, how many days a week do you engage in moderate to strenuous exercise? And on average, how many minutes per day do you exercise at this level? So a couple of simple questions, and doesn't take a lot of time, but they entered that into the electronic health record vital signs section. And then they had the opportunity to sort of test whether or not this had any clinical impact. And so they had rolled this out sequentially at a variety of KPN centers, and then compared what short-term outcomes had occurred comparing those in whom this change had occurred versus those it hadn't yet occurred. And what they found, interestingly enough, was that in overweight and obese patients, that those the medical centers that had rolled this out actually had a greater weight reduction compared to those centers that did not yet roll this out. Furthermore, they also found that there was better glycemic control in the centers that had rolled this out. So this was interesting, that just the collection of this information had resulted in better clinical outcomes. And I think it was shaped by the fact that people were having these conversations with their clinicians, and that could lead to the further referral to resources or ideas for how they might better care for their health. So one of the questions I think about is, well, should we be thinking about social support as a vital sign in this same kind of context? And in some of the clinicians, or sort of the conversations I've had with clinicians, some of the issues that tend to come up are, first of all, is can you measure it? Can you measure it accurately and non-invasively? Does it matter if you collect this information? Does it matter for clinical outcomes? The really critical piece that tended to come up over time a lot is this notion of ethics. Can you do something about it? Like, we may be interested in this information, but if you don't feel like you can refer to social support resources or do something for the patient, then maybe we shouldn't be collecting it. Logistic issues, can you create a clinical workflow to incorporate this information? And then finally, does it improve clinical care to collect this information? So I'm going to talk about a study that in our R01 that I had funded to try to develop a tool based on data in the EHR to enable clinicians to, with a one click, to identify patients who may have low levels of social support. And so to give you I have a graphic representation of some of the work that we're doing. We are, in some of the early conversations we had, we determined that there was some social support information in the EHR. And so we have done further work to identify what exists and how do people talk about social support. The linguistics of it is just fascinating. Anyway, so in the first part of the work, we've been pulling data from the EHR to just get a better sense of how that occurs. And we're also using natural language processing methods of these unstructured text notes in the EHR to develop these conceptual groups that sort of describe all the different ways that clinicians are collecting information on social support in patients. We're locating data from structured data sources as well, from BDW, Cancer Registry. And then our next task will be to create a weighted score from some of the conceptual terms that we are putting together. So to give you an idea of what we are finding in the EHR, the most common thing that we notice clinicians are collecting data on is their living situation. Are they living alone or with others? The second most common, as you might guess, is whether or not they have a partner or spouse. And the third most common is, and I think actually that's going to come up. I'll show you some statistics. But we have a series of concept groups that are sort of representing the way that clinicians are collecting this information. Ultimately, we want to validate the terms as well as the score that we're going to put together against some cohort data that we have validated social support outcomes. This is an example of a breast cancer intake note. They have the job of talking to the patient about their social support within a month after diagnosis. And so they're collecting information, as I mentioned, about their living situation. Do they have transportation issues? Maybe they work, where they work. Do they have a support person on the day of consultation? So they're trying to collect this information from a variety of different angles. And this was the slide that sort of represents, so this was kind of the big surprise. We knew there was some data on social support in the electronic health record, but we had learned of a directive that was put out in 2017 to collect this information. What we found was that clinicians had been collecting this data from the beginning of the EHR in 2006. And so when we have combined all of this data, we found that 98% of patients have at least one element of data on social support in the electronic health record, with about 94% having information on living arrangement, over 90% having information on partner, and about 90% having information on whether or not they have children. And you can see it falls off depending on the particular measure. We're obviously going to have to figure out like the missingness element in the development of the score. One of the important things of this particular work, so a lot of my work has reflected this thinking about health disparities. We know that there's differences in survival when you look by race and ethnicity. And we wanted to make sure in this work was not just that we were developing a tool, but that we were also going to result in the ability to have a large cohort in which we could look at the influence of social support on a variety of treatment outcomes and be able to look at those questions in diverse women. And so we wanted to make sure that there wasn't going to be evidence of differences in the availability of information by race and ethnicity. And you can see in the top part of this graphic, this forest plot, that there was no significant association of race with overall missingness even though we do see a strong association of stage with missingness. So in thinking about this question about whether you can do something about it, there's initiatives that have been rolled out, one in particular called Thrive Local at KP. And this was launched in 2019. And what it is sort of this data warehouse that exists locally for every different KP site across the country, where there's a collection of different resources that people can access through this particular database. Some of the resources that are include things like social enrichment, individual and family support, as well as transportation, 3 aspects that are directly related to this concern about lack of social support. There's other resources for patients that are available, including online social support networks, community resources, as well as clinical resources. I think the way that they've structured the workflow is that identification of issues leads to referrals to social workers and to mental health care experts. And I know that in talking with social workers, they also have a battery of resources that they can refer patients to. So in terms of the strengths of some of the study, we are using multiple sources, structured and unstructured, to help identify patients at risk of low social support. And there's a lot of rich data in text notes in particular about this. We're hoping to capture a range of risk. Like in community samples, people report about a quarter of them indicate that they're lonely or could use more levels of social support. Whereas previous work that we've identified using natural language processing approaches to get at information about social isolation in the EHR only resulted in about 1.5% of patients being identified as having that. So we're trying to create a score that is more exhaustive and could potentially capture a broader range of people who could use some additional assistance. So as I mentioned, we also want to use these data as a part of a large population representative cohort. The nice thing about it too is that we have a clinician board who has both advised this work and has the ability to shape the workflow and the ability to include this as a part of their workflow. Some of the limitations include variability over time. So we had learned about this directive in 2017. We see the data from 2006. So there is an increase in some of the availability of this data over time, with more data available in recent years. So we're going to have to make some decisions about how it makes sense to identify patients. But in terms of a cohort, I mean, that we're not obviously going to be using historical data to predict what goes with the patient now. So it may not be as much of an issue. There's also, we have sort of validated measures of social support in the research literature, and it's different from the way that social support is measured in the EHR. And so, we want to make sure that this is going to be a reasonable measure of social support or to help identify patients. There's the issue of timing of data relative to diagnosis is less of an issue when there is a directive to collect this information. And in breast cancer patients, that seems to be well in order. So we're also going to be considering, is this data collected in other kinds of cancer patients? And because we are aware that some of this data exists prior to sort of the diagnosis window. And regardless, there will be assumptions that will need to be made in the development of the score in terms of, like, if data is missing, if data is missing about lacking social support, does that mean they have support, or what other assumptions do we need to make? So should social support be a vital sign? Getting back to this question, I would say that yes, we have maybe hit the marker of measurement, that we are able to measure social relationships in terms of social ties, social support, and living status, and that's been being done in the EHR. I've shared a considerable evidence that these measures, or that these constructs, are in fact predictive of treatment outcomes and mortality, the clinicians are already thinking, what can we do? And they have it built into their workflow to do referrals, and KP more broadly is developing resources like Thrive Local to further the availability of those resources. So the question is whether or not the inclusion of this information, the collection of it, improves clinical care, and that is still to come. I would like to acknowledge a variety of collaborators that are involved in this particular project, as well as the collaborators that I've worked with and study participants in all the studies that I've shared. In summary, supportive social networks do seem to matter for cancer survival. There's a variety of resources that are available and have been rolled out and will continue to be rolled out within the KP setting. We're currently developing EHR support in breast cancer to further this work, but additional work will need to be done. There is a need for evaluation to be done to determine whether or not we should be collecting this information and can it improve clinical care. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate it. I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right, great, thank you. I want to start with a question from our virtual audience. Ann Blaze asks, how are you taking into account different cultures where social structures are often different or are not reported accurately in the EHR?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. One of the things that we tried to do early on was determine, so some of my work has really gotten into differences, disparities between Black and white women with breast cancer. And so when you look at some of the ways in which people obtain social support, the non-Hispanic white women in our samples may rely heavily on a spouse. Black women are less likely to be married and may rely more on religious networks. And so we wanted to determine whether or not there was information on religious institutions. And unfortunately, it was very limited. And so there will be, I think, issues with identifying certain kinds of support that are relevant in different groups. And so that is definitely something that should be considered. You know, should we be collecting additional information in the EHR, and especially, yes, especially with that considering culture and the different ways in which social support is collected. So, you know, we have been trying to collect additional information on social networks in different race ethnic groups to see what kinds of social support is important to them. And there's a collaborator of mine who is trying to further understand social support in Chinese patients, because there's sort of in that culture, there may be sort of more of a stigma about asking for social support. And so you're absolutely correct that this has to be considered, and it does get complicated, but it is something that I am thinking about in my work.
Do we have questions in the room? Oh, hang on.
A couple of questions. First, I'm curious how the ability to collect the data and the quality of data vary between urban, suburban, and rural populations.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's not something that we've considered. We do know that the site is related to the missingness of data, and that there are certain sites that have like nearly 100% of data and some sites that have almost none. And whether that is, it probably is actually related to the site. We don't have a lot of rurality in the KP network area, but I do suspect that on the sort of the periphery of the area that there may be less collection. And so that is something that we're going to have to be evaluating. Now, as more and more of those data are collected and that's becomes online, I think it's going to be more uniformly collected going forward. So for the clinical tool, that may not matter as much as it does for sort of the cohort that we're trying to build.
My other question is, how fundamentally different is this from outside the US. For example, if you go to the UK, where you have a universal healthcare system, which is spotty in its own right, but you also have locally based organizations that attempt to provide this, like the Macmillan Network, for example. How different is the nature of the data or the nature of the problem, or are either of those different?
It's a great question, and it's a fascinating consideration. I mean, obviously, when you have the healthcare systems set up economically in very different ways, it may profoundly shape how that's done. You know, and I feel like in the United States, the healthcare system is moving to think about social determinants of health because they know that prevention is just so much more cost efficient than treating, you know, things at the end when people are really ill. So I think it's possible that because of that move in that direction, that they'll look more similar. But it's not something that I've looked at to date, you know, how they're doing this. I would imagine that they have to be thinking about this. I've always been curious and would love to know. So I mentioned at KP, they're collecting this data and have been for some time. So what's going on in other healthcare institutions, even in the United States, are people collecting this data? Because I know when I talk to people, there's sort of the sense that we're not collecting it, but I think that this work has definitely taught me to be somewhat skeptical, that everybody has their perspective. Some people, they know some things and they have a key insight. Another group says something somewhat different because they're responsible for collecting this information. And then finally, we just ended up having to kind of determine from the medical record itself, like what is being done. And so there's a lot of conversations, and I think it's still a little bit of a Wild West in terms of what's going on and what's being done. And so that's, you know, part of the endeavor is to try to figure out, like, yeah, what's really going on.
All right, good. We've got a question from Dr. Yee. Can social media address social isolation? Is social media and/or support groups a way to address social isolation?
It's an interesting question. You know, there's definitely like Facebook, for example, has an initiative where they are specifically thinking about social support in breast cancer patients. We've been doing qualitative interviews in breast cancer patients, and we do note that Facebook comes up a lot. You know, people saying, okay, whether or not they tell like their entire network they have breast cancer and the support that results from that, it could be a useful component. I do think that some of the emerging literature about the corrosive aspect of social media is something that a person has to keep in the back of one's mind, just because, you know, that used, generally speaking, oftentimes you see it related to lower levels of mental health and mental health concerns. But it does seem like there's an opportunity there in very specific cases to connect people with cancer. Like for one example, people aren't just diagnosed with breast cancer, they're diagnosed with different subtypes of breast cancer. Or in other cancers, there may be subtypes that are very rare. And so being able to connect with others who not just that have been diagnosed with the disease, but have been diagnosed with that very specific subtype, so that they can get perspectives and information and share their experiences, could be very valuable in that particular context. In terms of social support groups, they do exist, and I think they could be of benefit. I know that when we've talked to patients, we do see people oftentimes not pursuing those opportunities because they're kind of worried about the effects of some of the other patients on them, either because they're a difficult person or because they don't want to hear like really, really sad things that could potentially influence their own emotions. I'm sort of, but I mean, people do get support. I'm sort of struck with, like I said, some qualitative data in which people have like, there's a lot of ad hoc support groups and occurring in waiting rooms where you're just waiting for the doctor's appointment and you start chatting with other people who are also waiting for the doctor, and how that can lead to some useful information sharing. So I don't think there's like one size fits all. There's going to be very different approaches, and they're all going to have a potentially useful role.
Okay, I've got a question here.
So social isolation also has very traumatic biological effects, at least in animal models, and I think humans, they have also found increased inflammation and other biological changes. So, and you showed data that the social interventions don't necessarily work as well as we would hope to. So do you know any efforts to try actually address the biological changes, perhaps in combination with the social support?
Yeah, I mean, this is a literature. It feels like there's a lot of work going on there, and a lot of people doing some really excellent work in biomarkers. I'm not sure of intervention specifically, but there's, I think of Andrew Steptoe or Steve Cole as two, in the cancer space. Now my name recall is gonna go down the tubes here. But I mean, there is work. Janice Keycole-Glaser has done a ton of work. It seems I think of her as kind of an intervention person. In terms of some of those, I would anticipate that they would see, results on effects of social support interventions on biomarkers, maybe somewhat parallel to the fact that these are pretty strongly positive. They're related to better quality of life. So I would anticipate some kind of physiological effect.
But how about combining, let's say, some kind of an anti-inflammatory treatment with the social support?
You're talking about like what you mentioned social networks in combination with social support.
So I'm thinking that in addition to trying to improve reduce the loneliness, perhaps giving patients also something that reduces their inflammation, like a medication or plant-based foods or something like that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure that I have thoughts right off about like sort of the combined influence of a series of interventions, but it seems like it's an important question to consider whether if you offer some kind of a pain intervention to patients with chronic pain, can a social support component further, increase the benefit? I mean, it would be a valuable question.
Thank you.
Okay. This will be our last question, if you'd like to read this question from Dr. Gupta.
Okay. What is the dose-response relationship between social connection and oncology outcomes and emotional well-being? Can a little bit do a lot for people without any support, but then plateau? Can there ever be too much? Yeah, I mean, it's one of the questions, one of the ideas that sort of comes up in this work is that if you take a group of people that already have really pretty good social support and you provide a little bit more social support to them, are they going to do differently than people who come with like really fractured social relationships? That there's so it's almost hard to comment about a dose-response relationship. I almost think about it as there's different types of people with different types of needs. Some people love having lots of people around them, and other people maybe a little bit could go a long way, and they're not necessarily going to benefit from these massive networks because they do appreciate a lot of solitude. So I think some of the addressing that particular question has to kind of consider how people are different. And I think part of the reason why I've been thinking about how this work can shape or should be thought of in terms of like neighborhood or health system contexts is because of this kind of thing, that you could, you're not necessarily always going to benefit somebody at the individual level, but can you create sort of systems, environments, places that can ultimately improve outcomes for all patients, regardless of who they are.
All right, that can be the end of our questions today. Let's say thank you one more time for Dr. Kroenke's presentation.
Thank you.